Hi, I'm Victoria, and this is Eyes on Crime. After posting my deep dive on the disappearance of Brian Shaffer, so many of you had questions and wanted to hear more about some of the smaller details in this case. So today, I'm doing a quick follow-up to go over a few pieces of information that didn't make it into the main video. Some are lesser-known facts, others are things that have fueled a lot of online discussion over the years. Hopefully you'll learn something new, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Let's get into it. If you watched my earlier video, Brian Shaffer vanished without a trace, we already walked through the full timeline of that night, where Brian went, who he was with, and what happened inside the ugly tuna. So I'm not going to repeat all of that today, but one thing we didn't really cover was the phone activity, the calls Brian made and the calls he received, and where that information originally came from. As you'll remember, Brian was last seen in the early morning hours of April 1st, 2006 at the Ugly Tuna. At first, the search got off to a slow start. His loved ones and friends thought he was probably sleeping in after a long night, or that he had taken some time for himself. It wasn't until he missed a planned flight to Miami on Monday, April 3rd, that his father reported him missing to Columbus police. But once the official search was underway, Brian's family was determined to get answers. However, those answers weren't easy to come by. On September 21st, during a Fox News interview, Brian's father, Randy Shaffer, spoke openly about his frustration with how the Columbus police were handling the search. He said, "Almost 6 months have gone by, and I don't know any more now than what I did 6 months ago. Certain things I wish the police would tell me some of what they've done. I would almost like to say to them sometimes, what would you do if it was your son, your daughter? Would you bend the rules just a little bit?" Frustrated with how the investigation was going, Randy brought on a private investigator, a man named Don Corbett, because he felt the Columbus police weren't moving the case forward fast enough. Corbett volunteered to help and worked with Randy, gathering a number of records related to the case. He allegedly retained copies of the materials he had collected, including phone records, bank records, legal letters, emails, and other documents. According to multiple online sources, Randy Shaffer cut ties with Don Corbett around 2007, likely early to mid-year, after becoming uncomfortable with how Corbett was publicizing details about the case online. By that point, Corbett was already in possession of the records he had collected. Since then, some of those old records have made their way online. Parts of them have circulated over the years, especially in Reddit discussions about the case. A Columbus photographer and podcast host named Kelly Bruce, who has followed this case closely, also appears to have obtained copies of those records at some point. Now, to be clear, the exact chain of custody on these files isn't entirely known, but it is widely believed that the phone call timeline that's circulated online originally traces back to Corbett's materials, not to official police records and not directly from Sergeant Hurst. It's also worth noting that police have remained extremely tight-lipped about this case. Outside of limited contact with Sergeant Hurst, they have reportedly declined requests from Kelly to meet or share information, in part because she does not hold official media credentials. So any version of the phone records she obtained likely came from those older materials, not from police sources. For this video, I created my own version of the phone call timeline based on information that has circulated publicly online. So now let's take a closer look at that timeline. After having dinner with his dad at Outback Steakhouse, Brian gave him a call at 8:41 p.m. The reason for that call isn't known. Around 9 p.m., Alexis called Brian. No details about that call or whether Brian answered have ever been shared. A few minutes later at 9:06 p.m., Brian called Brandon Shattuny. Brandon was also a medical student at Ohio State and part of the group Brian was trying to meet up with that night. At 9:56 p.m., Alexis called Brian again while she was visiting her family in Toledo. They spoke briefly, and Brian told her he was spending the night talking with friends about her. At 10:03 p.m., Brian called Graham Davis, a college friend. Graham was reportedly one of the friends Brian met up with that night. A little after that, at 10:43 p.m., Brian called Matt Ryan, a very close friend. They had made plans to get together the following day. At 10:59 p.m., Brian called Graham Davis again. He reportedly met up with him later that evening. Then at 11:20 p.m., Brian checked his voicemail, even though he didn't have any missed calls. Who was he hoping to hear from? Just a minute later, at 11:21 p.m., Jeremy Douglas called Brian. Reports suggest he was part of the group Brian met up with that night, along with Brandon, Jason, and Graham. At 11:57 p.m., a call was placed from Jason Fistakovich's phone to Brian's, but Jason later claimed that Brandon Shatuni had used his phone to make that call. Jason also said this was the first time he had ever met Brian. When Meredith and Clint were ready to leave and couldn't find Brian, Meredith used Clint's phone to call him at 2:01 a.m. She left a voicemail saying, "Where the hell are you?" Since Clint had left his car at Brian's the night before, Meredith dropped him off the next morning to pick it up. Around 10 a.m., Clint called Brian and left a voicemail saying, "Hey, I lost you last night." But considering he was right there in Brian's parking lot, it's interesting that he didn't just go up and knock on the door. When you really look at it, there were a lot of calls from a lot of different people, even though Brian was already out with friends. And it really makes you wonder, why were so many people trying to reach him that night? Were they just hoping to meet up and have drinks, celebrate spring break? Or was there something else going on? I've read in several sources that there was talk of an after party. And that would line up with why so many people were trying to connect with him. It's hard to imagine Brian being that social with so many people, only to just call it a night right after. Speaking of relationships, there has been a lot of curiosity about the true nature of Brian and Clint's connection. They lived together at one point. They were reportedly linked romantically, on and off. Their friendship was said to have many ups and downs, which may have contributed to the decision to live separately. Leading up to Brian's disappearance, several reports say the two had been fighting, some say for a couple of weeks. However, they seemed to patch things up enough to celebrate spring break together. That night, many people saw them arguing. They appeared visibly upset, but the music was too loud for anyone to hear what was being said. No one seems to know exactly what disagreement was about, while some online rumors suggest that Brian may have been flirting with one of Clint's students or that personal jealousy played a role. None of that has been verified. This may also help explain why Clint chose to step back from the case. Some believe he simply did not want private parts of his life becoming public, and it is important to remember. Back in 2006, attitudes around sexuality were very different than they are today. Another part of this case that's led to a lot of speculation is the money. And some believe it may have played a bigger role behind the scenes than people realized. There's long been talk in local circles, including on podcasts like True Crime Garage, that Brian had been upset with his dad, Randy, because Randy was allegedly having an affair before Renee passed away. According to the story, Brian told his mom about it, and after finding out, Renee may have changed her life insurance policy. Now, there's also been a lot of discussion online about whether Brian ever received any money from his mom's will or life insurance. What is known is that his brother Derek received $20,000, but many believe Brian didn't get that money outright, because if he had, it could have triggered repayment of his student loans. If those funds were in his name, he might have had to start paying on those loans immediately. So there's been talk that the money may have been passed to him more quietly. And when you look at it, between his credit card payments and 4 checks, $425 each, that adds up to about $16,400, which is pretty close to what Derek received. Some also believe that Renee may have kept a private account, maybe to protect money from Randy, since there were concerns about his drinking or spending. It's possible she used some of that money to help pay off Brian's debts before she passed. But the $5,275 cash deposit is where things really get interesting. There's been a lot of conversation about how Brian came up with that much cash, especially since he didn't have a job at the time. It seems unlikely that it came from his mom. If those smaller checks were from her, she'd already been writing checks to him, so if she wanted to give him $5,000, why not just write one bigger check? The cash just doesn't fit the pattern. $5,000 isn't just pocket change, it's a lot of money now, and it was an even bigger deal 19 years ago. So for Brian to have that kind of cash with no clear source, it definitely raises some questions. This is also reportedly why Brian was an hour late to his mom's funeral. Of course, he was devastated. They had always been very close. But with the weight of his parents' conflict and the strained family dynamics, maybe he just couldn't face it. And at that point, Would anyone have even known exactly how the insurance money was going to be distributed? If so, that could have made the stress within the family even harder to navigate. So many of the early reports really painted Brian as the all-American med student who vanished without a trace. But in reality, he was carrying a lot. He'd watched his mom fight hard and then lose her battle with cancer right in front of him. He was torn between following a medical path or pursuing music, something he'd written about on his MySpace bio, and there was tension within his family too, just to name a few of the pressures he was under at the time. Like so many people facing that kind of weight, it's been said that Brian sometimes turned to alcohol and other unhealthy ways to cope. And just to be clear, I'm not trying to paint him in a bad light. He was human like all of us, but I do think it's important to understand what his life looked like at that point and what factors might have contributed to his disappearance. One of the few times we've heard more personal insight about Brian came in a 2019 interview. Brian's cousin Dan described Brian as dark and secretive. He said he wouldn't have been surprised if substance use had somehow played a role in Brian's disappearance. But when private investigator Don Corbett appeared on that same show, he firmly disagreed, saying there was no way Brian was dealing with any serious personal issues. Still, Corbett acknowledged that Brian kept parts of his life private, even from those closest to him. He also shared that sometime after Brian went missing, the father of one of Brian's friends had dropped off a box of Brian's personal belongings. Inside were some of Brian's writings, which Corbett described as dark and bizarre. This case has drawn in so many people over the years, especially in Ohio, where it's always hit close to home. Many people were consumed with the case, searching for answers and unable to let it go. Even after the family had distanced themselves from Corbett and decided to stop working with him, he continued to stay involved, posting on blogs and forums and reaching out to people tied to the case. Corbett had apparently asked Clint to take a polygraph. In response, in September of 2008, Clint's attorney, Neil Rosenberg, sent what would become a well-known email in this case, explaining why Clint had refused. In that email, Rosenberg explained that Clint had fully cooperated with police and that his refusal to take a polygraph was based on Rosenberg's legal advice, not because Clint was hiding anything. He said Clint had been upfront from the start and had nothing new to tell investigators. Rosenberg also pointed out that Clint's story had been backed up by the woman he was with that night, who had taken and passed a polygraph. He wrote that he had personally met with law enforcement, reviewed the surveillance footage from that night, and called the situation a confusing and strange set of circumstances. He stated that from Clint's point of view, the matter was closed and asked that neither he nor Clint be contacted again. But what stood out to many was how Rosenberg ended the email, saying the detective had led him to believe that Brian might still be alive. He wrote, quote, "If Brian is alive, which is what I'm led to believe after speaking with the detective involved, then it is Brian and not Clint who is causing his family pain and hardship. Brian should come forward and end this." End quote. Something else that I don't think gets talked about enough is the break-in at Brian's apartment. It happened on May 11th, 2006, just over a month after he disappeared. Columbus police have said they don't believe the break-in was connected to Brian's case. The theory was that someone realized Brian's apartment was empty, either from hearing about the case or word spreading locally, and decided it was an easy target. But here's where I have some doubts. In those early news reports, Brian's exact address wasn't listed, and they definitely didn't mention that he lived alone. According to the police report, a neighbor told officers they knew the apartment was unoccupied because Brian had been reported missing. That same night, 3 apartments in the complex were broken into, including Brian's next-door neighbor's unit, which was also kicked in. Alexis could see Brian's apartment from her own. She was reportedly staying at his place often after he went missing, possibly most nights or even every night. Thankfully, she wasn't there when the break-in happened, and this wasn't a quiet entry. Around 2 a.m., a neighbor heard loud knocking, then crashing sounds, followed by movement inside Brian's apartment. The front door and door jamb had been kicked in. Whoever it was stole a TV and some DVDs, but left behind 2 guitars and other electronics. About an hour later, around 3 a.m., Columbus police called Alexis to let her know what had happened. At the time, the search for Brian was still very active. The reward had just been temporarily raised to $100,000 in hopes of generating new leads. But no tips came in, and the reward later dropped back down to $25,500. Now, police officially said the break-in was likely unrelated, but think about it. The person who did this made a lot of noise, risked being seen by neighbors, and somehow picked a night when Alexis wasn't there. I don't think that's random. To me, it sounds more like someone who knew Brian and may have known Alexis's schedule too. But when you step back, there are still so many unanswered questions about what happened after Brian was last seen. One clue that sparked a lot of theories is the reported scent trail. Search dogs brought in by Columbus police, along with other teams hired by Brian's father, are said to have tracked Brian's scent heading away from the Ugly Tuna. The trail reportedly stopped at Wendy's, which has led to theories that Brian may have gotten into a vehicle. Supporting this theory, retired Columbus police officer John Hurst has stated that Brian exited the building through the construction plywood doors downstairs across from the Wendy's. There is no confirmed evidence of a vehicle being involved and no verified sightings of Brian after the scent trail ended. It has been widely speculated that Brian and Meredith didn't get along. Some believe that because Brian didn't like her, was arguing with Clint, and had been making plans with other people that night for some sort of after party. Maybe he wanted to ditch them and went out an alternative exit. But if the scent dogs were right and he really did make it out through that side exit, where did he go next? There's also been a lot of talk online about one of the women from that night, Brighton Zacho. On Reddit, some users have pointed out older public property records tied to her name. Some of those addresses were close to the area where Brian's phone reportedly pinged later on. Now, it's important to remember that public records aren't always accurate, and having an old address in that part of Columbus isn't proof of anything. A lot of Ohio State students lived in that area at the time. Still, this theory has stayed alive online for a few other reasons. According to reports, Columbus police interviewed both Amber and Brighton after Brian disappeared. Both women said they hadn't seen Brian again that night, and when police asked about potential leads, they said they had no definitive information on who Brian may have left with, but a few more details later came out. According to an interview, Brian reportedly kissed Brighton on the neck at some point that evening. Brighton had also reportedly given Brian her phone number that night at the Ugly Tuna. Over the years, Kelly Bruce and Brighton stayed loosely in touch. More acquaintances than close friends. Kelly would check in from time to time. Eventually, Kelly decided to follow up with Brighton again. During one of those conversations, she asked a question she hadn't asked before. "Did you ever see Brian again that night?" According to Kelly, Brighton hung up on her and later blocked her online. Now again, none of this proves any direct connection between Brighton and Brian's disappearance, but it stirred plenty of debate and kept this theory going online. So where does the investigation stand now? At this point, many in the public, including those closest to the case, like Don Corbett, have lost faith in how Columbus police have handled the case. Corbett has stated recently that he believes key information was withheld and that the department failed to fully pursue critical leads. He also said the department has repeatedly denied requests for records, even after formal FOIA requests and a meeting with the city attorney. He's questioned whether their work was thorough from the start and accused the department of keeping too much behind closed doors. It's clear that criticism over how this investigation has been handled is still running high, even all these years later. Well, that's everything I have to cover for this follow-up. I know today's video was a little different, but I really wanted to go back and highlight some of these extra details that don't always get talked about. Sometimes the smaller details end up being the most important. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation released an age-progressed photo of what Brian Shaffer might look like today, hoping the image might generate new leads in the case. If you have any information at all about Brian's disappearance, please contact Columbus Police at 614-645-4545. Thank you again for watching Eyes on Crime. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to have you here. I'm working toward my next big goal of reaching 10,000 subscribers, so if you found this video helpful, please give it a like and share it with anyone who might be interested. And if there's a case you'd like me to cover in the future, just leave a suggestion down in the comments. Take care, and I'll be back soon with another video.